Welcome to the Legacy in Motion podcast. I'm your host, Samuel Teka. This is the podcast where we equip diaspora leaders to build healthy and thriving intergenerational ministries. In this podcast, we explore the realities of ministry within immigrant and diaspora communities, how different generations experience faith, culture, and the church in unique ways, and what it takes to build unity across those differences while staying faithful to Christ. To help us think through this, I'm joined by Yevgeniy Kovalenko, author of Cultural Crossroads. His work has helped shape much of the conversation around intercultural and intergenerational ministry. I really enjoyed this conversation with him, and I believe it will encourage and challenge you as well. Enjoy the conversation. Why do you think this conversation is going to be valuable to people when they listen or watch this specific podcast? What do you think?
Well, knowing your audience from what I've observed and what we talked about before, I think we have the same background, same story as a diaspora church, and so I think that story matters in our culture today, and I think we all have shared experiences that can help us advance the gospel. At the end of the day, it's about the gospel, and I really want and believe that immigrant church has potential to do amazing things in the future of America, where in our communities where we live.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good that you pointed out that we have similar stories. Maybe if you don't mind, can you share a little bit of your background and that journey leading up to you writing this book, Cultural Crossroads, which I have right here, which I got the chance to read. But yeah, please share with me that journey, and then maybe we'll get into some of the questions I was going to ask you.
So I immigrated to United States in 2001 with my family. I was 14 years old, so I was a teenager, what I call 1.5 generation in my book. And so it's a very strange time to switch places, right? It's a difficult time, but so I came to House of the Gospel. That's the church I'm currently. I'm an associate pastor at this church, and I've got baptized in this church. I met my wife in this church, dedicated to all of our 4 kids in this church, and lived through it all. I mean, we were predominantly Slavic church community. So Ukrainian, Russian immigrants predominantly, we had the struggles, we had the silent exodus, we had all kinds of things going on that most immigrant churches experience.
Right.
And so before we got married with my wife, we had a prayer. We fasted for a year about future of our family and where God wants to see us. And that kind of grew into, to make long story short, into a Bible study that we hosted at our house. And we saw people from all generations, from not just Slavic, but from culture around us, start attending our Bible studies, becoming Christians. And the question arose is, where are we bringing them? We need to bring them to church. And at our church, we just had a Russian-Ukrainian speaking service. And so out of that came this desire to see our church integrate into our society, honoring our past, but also integrating into the society so we can preach the gospel to people around us. And so out of that came the planting of English service at our church, and that's been going on for the last 14 years, where I have privilege of pastoring and preaching.
That's amazing. So you brought up the phrase, the silent exodus, which is powerful. I wanted to ask you, why do you think younger generations quietly drift away from immigrant churches?
Um, yeah, the word silent exodus, the phrase, I didn't come up with this. It's a phrase that's been coined before, but it's a phrase that describes the. It kind of takes the biblical language to describe the exodus,
Right.
the departure of younger generations from the church. Um, and it's the key word there is silent, because the younger generation oftentimes leaves without an anger, without creating big commotion, but just quietly leaving because they don't want to create problems. Um, they respect their parents, they respect their culture, but somewhere along the way they stopped feeling connected.
Mm.
And so one major reason is cultural disconnect between the first and the second generation. There's a book called Psychology of Cultural Shock, and it talks about the idea of how the assimilation happens at a different rate between the first and the second generation when they come to a new country. And so that because of that, the younger generation assimilate faster, and oftentimes for them the church and the world around them becomes two different worlds, and they literally, there's this language, they live in between two worlds.
Right.
And so they come to church on Sunday, and language is different, culture is different, and they go outside and there's a disconnect between the spiritual language and the language outside in their schools and at their workplaces. And that creates this disconnect that is that many people are struggling with. And the word there is, they find themselves constantly translating between the two worlds. And if you've ever been in that situation, and those of listeners or viewers who are watching us, they can relate. And that constant translation is exhausting.
Yes.
It's exhausting. And so out of that, silent exodus happens, and it becomes a problem in the church.
Yeah, this is something that, as I was reading your book, and I've mentioned it in our first interaction with one another, I said that your story and even reading your book is very relatable in the sense that that tension first and foremost, and also the experience of that silent exodus. I mean, I've seen it time and time again, hearing story after story of diaspora immigrant churches having to see their young ones grow up in the church, but eventually, I think around the age of around the grade of high school and then college, end up just slowly dissipating and leaving their congregation. So the silent exodus is such a perfect term to describe, I believe, some of the tensions that we're feeling in most of our churches today. You describe diaspora churches living between preserving heritage and embracing mission, which was wonderful, and I really love that. Why do you think that tension is so difficult to navigate?
Yeah, I think, kind of stepping back a little bit, I think both sides, the first generation, the 1.5, the second generations, come from good. Heritage is good. Mission matters as well. Mission is important to the church. Heritage is important to the church. And so immigrant churches were, oftentimes when we look back in my book, I describe these three phases of ethnic churches. And again, every church is unique and different. And I'm for the fear of generalizing, but there's these three different phases. And the first phase is the phase of the beginning phase, or what I call the refuge phase, where immigrants come to the church and they view the church as their refuge place. It's their haven in the middle of this weird and different culture. And for them, and so these churches are born oftentimes out of sacrifice, suffering, survival. Some of them in our Slavic community, a lot of them come from the history of persecution in Soviet Union. maybe hardship, displacement, as refugees. And so for many first-generation church members, church becomes a spiritual and a cultural refuge. Right. And over time, wrong or not wrong, the heritage and the spiritual kind of blends in. And so when younger generation comes in and trying to implement some changes, to them, these changes are not necessarily about heritage. It's now almost spiritual. It's not just cultural. Now it's becoming about their spirituality. And so when change begins to happen, it can feel emotionally threatening even. It's almost like they're fearing of losing part of their identity of who they are.
Oh, wow.
And at the same time, the next generation is growing up, and they're growing up in a completely different world, culture, environment, and they're asking questions like, how do we live in this culture while we respect the heritage of our parents? And so that creates this in-between reality that I describe in my book, and diaspora churches often find themselves standing between the two worlds, honoring the past, while trying to navigate and faithfully engage the culture, their neighbors around their churches. And how do we navigate from and avoid separating ourselves and living in these silos or bubbles? And how do we engage the community around us in a faithful way while respecting our heritage? And that creates a lot of tension. Again, writing this book, I'm really trying not to sound like I have all the answers, because I don't. The point of my book is to tell stories, and I have a lot of case studies of real churches and how they navigated it. I do provide some models and some ideas, but at the end of the day, each church has their own stories. They have their own backgrounds and nuances, and it's each church needs. My hope is that this book can help them give some principles and some ideas and some biblical principles. But at the end of the day, man, we have to be so careful to make sure that it applies and it's contextualized to our story of our churches.
Yeah, so good. I love that you said that, because not every context is the same.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily a copy and paste method. You really do have to observe. You do have to take introspect of your church, your context, your people, and contextualize it to that specific location or to these particular people. And I think sometimes, Yevgeniy, you could correct me if I'm wrong or right, but I think sometimes it's easier to do a copy and paste, and sometimes that just doesn't work. And leaders just really end up being frustrated.
Yeah.
Most of the time they end up making the person that they serve with to be the enemy as opposed to a team member. But really, if we are to look at our context and observe what works for us, I think we can make for a better church and a better congregation. Yeah. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, just to add to that, one of the ideas that I shared, I believe it's in chapter 8, I shared these principles, and one of the principles is some of the successful churches I observed, immigrant churches I observed, they lead out of identity, not imitation. And the idea there is, I mean, as younger member of an immigrant church, I think we've all been there. You go to a conference, kind of mainstream church conference, maybe some kind of mega church, and you're like, whoa, that's cool, that works. Oh, look what they did there,
Right.
And we come back to our church, our community, whatever church, the Diaspora church, and we're like, we're gonna do this now, we're gonna, implement this, what Craig Rochelle did at his church, or whatever, that is. Yeah. And it's like, you're not Craig Rochelle, you're not that, you are your church. There's this idea, this one author, he's a worship pastor, he talks about this idea, this Latin phrase, it's called sui generis. And sui generis it means of its own kind. And what he encourages in his book is, he says, churches should be sui generis, meaning like of its own kind. We should not try to
Mm,
imitate. We should learn from other churches, for sure. There's wisdom in that.
sure.
But we should be of our own kind, meaning like it's okay to embrace some of the weirdness of our church, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah,
It's not weirdness, it's who God created us to be. And
very good.
you leverage that, and we can talk about leveraging as well. You leverage that to share the gospel. And I think there's that balance between all those things. But yeah, copy paste never works. It never works.
Yeah. Can you actually go into leveraging? Like
Yeah.
what does that mean? What does that look like exactly? Please share your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Because
So
I think it will benefit a lot of people.
yeah. So in chapter 7 of my book, I talk about this idea of leverage.
Hmm.
Oftentimes or sometimes as an immigrant church, we view ourselves through the lens of deficiency or struggle.
Mm,
Oftentimes we see ourselves as we're minority, we don't have this, we don't have
right.
that. Sometimes it even grows into this unhealthy victim mentality.
Mm,
Not to say that there's injustice. There is injustice, and there's
hmm.
sometimes are real, genuine struggles that diaspora churches experience. Not to
Hmm.
diminish that,
Hmm.
but that cannot become our identity.
Hmm.
And so, what I argue for is that as in diaspora churches, we have certain traits and certain qualities that we can leverage to our advantage and ultimately to preach the gospel, to advance the gospel in our communities. So, uh, for example, I mean, you observe our culture today. Our
Mm,
culture is struggling with idea of community. I mean, our we're so connected, and yet everyone is so isolated behind their phones, and it just in general, like
right.
there's this idea of isolation. But you look at most immigrant churches, the idea of community is very strong in immigrant
Mm,
churches.
mm,
Most immigrant churches, they come from collectivist societies.
right.
We live in the most individualistic society.
Right. Right.
Not to say that one is wrong or one is better. It's just that's the reality of our world today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think in a world that is so desperate, or in a culture that is so desperate for community, um, diaspora churches can image that, can offer that to many people. In one of my chapters, I share a story of that Bible study I talked about in the
Yeah. Yeah.
beginning.
Yeah. Mm,
We had so many people come, and they stayed for until so late in our house, and they
yeah.
enjoyed my wife's food, and they enjoyed the
Yeah.
community aspect, because where else are you going to experience that these
So
days,
good.
And
Mm,
so I think community is one of the things. Another one is family values. In a
mm,
society that is constantly, through movies, through culture, um, uh, um, uh, destroys family, dismantles idea of family.
right.
I think statistically, and I share those stats in my book. Statistically, immigrant families are much stronger family units, and they
Mm,
also image that. I mean, in our church, we have families who are non-Slavic, who are outside of our community, who joined
mm,
because they observed strong families. They observed families
yes.
with kids, and they observed families with, parents and kids sitting together in a church service and worshiping God
Yes.
together. And
Yes.
that's another leverage point that is, I think, so relevant in our broken culture today. That I
Yeah.
think it's churches can leverage that. I mean, a few other quick ones. Resilience. I think to
Mm,
immigrant to another country, it takes a lot of guts
right.
to find jobs, to build a new career, to
Right.
learn a language. Statistically, I bring those stats as well. Immigrants are one of the leading entrepreneurs in America, and
Mm,
that mentality, when applied to church, man, that can be leveraged for some great gospel integration, great leverage. And so,
absolutely.
but again, unless we realize that and start implementing that, it will never kind of get traction. So, those are some of the leverage points I
Yeah.
discuss.
So good. So good. I really do believe that. I do believe when you talk about leveraging there are just certain values that are implemented and also held to very high esteem in some parts of the world that just aren't here.
Yeah.
And I just find it fascinating that I think there's always this tension and this play going on, especially in the West, where people crave for community, people crave to want to be in relationships, yet at the same time they're fighting the tension of also being individualistic, just to use one example that you mentioned. And I really do believe that the Diaspora Church or the Immigrant Church does have that value to offer, to bring a certain sense of joy and happiness and fullness and wholeness in people's lives, especially those that live here. So I'm second gen, grew up in Canada. Parents are from Ethiopia. And growing up in the Ethiopian church, we often, if I could speak on behalf of second generation Ethiopians, or maybe just diaspora, just generally, is there's a lot of misunderstanding between the first generation and the second generation. And I just would love for you to address maybe some of those misunderstandings between both generations, and how can we bridge that gap? How can we remedy those misunderstandings between both generations?
Yeah, in the book I talk about these gaps between well, I talk about the external gaps between the diaspora church and society, and then I talk about some gaps internally within the church itself.
Right.
But when it comes to generations, yeah, for sure there's gaps. I mean, there's language gap in the church.
Right.
That's usually where it starts, I think, where there's younger generations just don't speak the language or don't understand. Right. Even maybe they speak the language at home, but they don't understand the church language, the religious language in the church. And so they can speak to their parents in the house, no problem, in their native tongue. And then when they come to church, the biblical language is like, I don't get it. I interviewed one of the pastors, a Hispanic pastor here in California, and he did a survey in his church, and he of younger people, and he was shocked to realize that they said majority of them did not understand. They said something like 80% of the language at church, even though it was Spanish. And I mean, we live in California, you know, and what they mentioned to him is like the language at home, even though they speak Spanish at home, the language at home and church, there's this connection, and that creates certain gaps within generations. I mean, there's gaps like worldview gap, and we briefly talked about that, collectivist versus individualistic society.
Yes.
That creates certain gaps of how we approach how younger leaders think about leadership in church. One of the examples is when we were just beginning the English services. I'm a bivocational, so I'm a project manager, work in engineering firm. So I'm very schedule, bullet points, get to the point. But in our Slavic culture, with first generation, and I think that applies to many other cultures outside of the United States. It's not about bullet points and action items. It's about let's talk about it. You know, let's discuss this and let's talk it over. And to me, it seemed like we're just going in circles.
Right.
While for them, it was important to discuss this thing, to talk, maybe go late into the night and have discussions, because that's how they process things.
Right.
Here I am, a young buck comes in with a bullet point, one-page list of what needs to be done. You know, it's like, no, that's not how it works. And that creates some tensions. And so the first generation, oftentimes looking at these tensions, they see them and they fear losing what they fought to preserve. To them, this is again kind of this attack on their identity, while the next generation fear losing the connection to the world they're trying to reach.
Wow.
And that fear creates this tension between the generations, and I mean, and again, that leads to either silent exodus or sometimes, unfortunately, divisions and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. So I'm curious, this is kind of outside of the questions that I sent you. I hope that's okay.
That's fine.
I'm curious, how do you get to a place as a church, intergenerational church, where you do have both generations, and there's a lot of misunderstanding. There are views, there are perspectives, there are lenses by which we look at the world through. And let's just say, hypothetically speaking, that maybe first generation or the second generation are stubborn to not maybe see from the other person's perspective or from the other generation's perspective. It could go either way. What can we do to actually begin to, because the whole point of Legacy in Motion is how do we create healthy intergenerational ministries? So how do we get to that place, or do you have any examples on how to actually begin to create that unity and that bond between the both generations with a lot of these misunderstandings that we see?
Yeah. Again, I think this is one of those things that I can throw principles at you, but
right.
Whoever's watching or listening, you know your church. But I think there's basic foundational biblical ideas that that can be applied here. In one of the chapters, I talk about, as an example, I talk about Antioch, first multi-ethnic church, and it's such an interesting study. I mean, Acts 11. It's just reading that about that church. It's just fascinating. Yeah. But in the church, they have. I mean, they're an edgy church. They're doing things that are different from church in Jerusalem. Again, the church was born out of displacement, out of refugees fled Jerusalem because of persecution, and a lot of them went to Antioch, and they started this church. But one of the things about that church, among so many other things, they have a strong connection to their mother church, to Jerusalem church. And when they start pushing the boundaries and they start reaching out to the Gentiles, the mother church in Jerusalem are like, they're hearing these things like, whoa, hold on. I mean, and they're like, let us send Barnabas and Paul. They need to investigate what exactly is going on in that church. I mean, if that doesn't sound like a typical tension between first and second gen, well, like, hold on, what are you doing at your youth services? Hold on, what are you doing? What's up with that worship style or whatever that is, But the reaction of Antioch church was very humble. They with humility, they accepted them, and Paul and Barnabas stayed there, and they had discussions, and they accepted the wise counsel from Jerusalem church. Right. And so all that to say, I think when it comes to these tensions and how do you bridge them, how do you heal them, I think it's not about strategy, it's about posture. It's about posture. That's good. So division happens when integration becomes about power, and younger people like, well, show them how to do things, or fear. No, don't do any fear of change. Don't do any changes, because again, it's that connection between culture and your spirituality, and now the older generation feels threatened. Their faith is threatened by changes, and maybe that's not even true. And so when things are driven by power or fear or competition between cultures within the church, that creates that division. But when we look at the posture of humility, and again, that does not happen overnight. That's maybe years of conversations for our church. And I'm not saying our church is perfect example. It's just my story is, it took us 2 years to open an English service. Wow. It's 2 years of conversations, 2 years of meeting up individually, addressing questions. It's and then we did like a trial period, and then we did so we did everything possible for it to be a smooth transition. Now, again, a lot of tension still was there, but it's the posture of humility from both sides. I think that's what matters. Easier said than done, but it's about posture.
Yeah, I mean, what you're basically saying is that it's a journey. It's a journey, and that journey is not going to be easy. And as a matter of fact, it's going to require both groups to really put in the effort, to have that posture of humility, to actually see this vision being birthed.
Yes.
Or unity to be prevalent in our ministries. I love that. I think you argue that immigrant churches may play a major role in the future of Christianity in America. What unique strengths do diaspora churches bring to the broader church?
Yeah.
Would you say?
In my research, I found a quote by Tim Keller, and he was talking to in an interview to one of the diaspora churches, and he said that immigrant churches might be holding the key, he said, to the future of America. I mean, it's a bold statement, but I think thinking about the leverage points that we mentioned, strong families, community, I think some of the tensions that the diaspora churches experience can actually become the strengths when it comes to bringing something to the future of America. What I mean is, I mentioned before that many diaspora churches and first 1.5 and second gen kids, they live in between. That right there is a huge strength when it comes to bringing the gospel into a growing America that is growing in diversity and multiculturalism. Whether we want it or not, America is very multicultural. Our world is becoming very interconnected between cultures, and so as America is growing more in diversity, having the trait of knowing how to navigate between cultures, how to use that word again, to translate between the culture. And I'm not talking about just language. I'm talking about translating cultures, translating worldviews. That trait, that is a valuable characteristic to have when it comes to planting new churches. Planting churches in urban contexts when it's very diverse and you need to navigate. There's this phrase in I didn't include this in the book, but it's this phrase in Celtic mythology, or maybe it's Celtic history, of in that culture they had these tribes living next to each other, and in those tribes there were certain people called Mastistrapa, and it's this old word that basically translates as border walkers. And these were people who would be walking between borders of different clans, and they would negotiate between the clans. They would be border walkers. And I think that a lot of 1.5 generation and second generation are the border walkers. They are the future of America, of Christian America, who are going to be walking between the borders, between the cultures, and bridging them, you know? Because they have the skills for it. I mean, you grow up in an immigrant church, you have the skill for that. You walked between borders. You translated for between your parents and appointments. You know, let's start from there. You know, you translated cultural concepts to your parents. You translated that to the first generation in your church. You translated then when you're trying to integrate into the culture, and that alone is amazing, valuable characteristic and leverage that can bring a lot of healthy integration into the culture.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's such a great note to end on, because I think that will encourage a lot of leaders and pastors as they walk out this journey of creating healthy intergenerational ministry. Yevgeniy, thank you so much for your time and chatting with me. Your book was phenomenal. And as I said earlier, I felt like you were reading my diary in a lot of ways. And it just related to me a lot. So I really appreciate you.
Sam, thank you for inviting me. And I'm really excited about your ministry and the ministry of Diaspora Network. It's amazing what you guys are doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.